One thing about being an amateur pianist is that when there's a piano around, friends will quite often ask us to play something. Now, lively music I found always goes down well, so today I'd like to propose a little tutorial on Scott Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag. Not only is this a great little party piece, but it's also an excellent way of practicing lively jumps in the left hand. Are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. Hi, this is Tommy with Tommy's Piano Corner, the place for returning pianists or indeed anyone who loves piano to share tips and ideas of how to get the best from this great hobby. If it is your first trip here, then please do think about subscribing. Simply hit the little icon in the bottom right hand corner of your screen now and it's all done for you. When friends do ask us to play something, I think there are three important things to bear in mind. The first, I've said before, is to keep things around about this magic 3-minute mark that people are used to these days. The second thing is, let's remember that the environment and quite often the piano that we need to play on isn't necessarily that great, so it's as well to avoid anything that's too nuanced. And then finally, I think lively music always goes down very well. A piece then that I think meets all of these three criteria is Scott Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag. And even better, we also have the opportunity to abridge it, so we only play sort of the better known first half. So today I'd like to give you some ideas of how we might go about practicing this particular piece. And we'll focus on the first 50 or so measures. Now I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail here, but don't worry, you don't need to know anything down or worry about it. I've created a set of practice notes for you that you can download so you can work through this at your own pace. And to do it, I'm going to use what I'm calling my 4-step method, which is to discover, to divide, to conquer, and then to finally integrate. So let's start off with discover then. I think it's really important before we start to try and learn a piece of music that we take some time to find out what it's all about. So for example, we can listen to some good recordings of it by good pianists. We can study the score intently, we make sure we understand the dynamics, we understand the structure, we can see where the climax of the piece is likely to be. All of these things are really important so that when we set off to practice something, we've got a good idea in our minds of the end result we might want to achieve. Next, as regular viewers will know, I'm a big fan of splitting things down into what I call a nested hierarchy, which I've sort of nicknamed sections, segments, and snippets. This basically means that I've got some very small building blocks that I can work on to get under control first, and then I can start to progressively add them back together again. Now, in this particular instance, I think there are basically 3 main sections. But luckily for us, the third section is pretty much a repeat of the first, so there's less notes to learn, but of course it does give us the additional challenge of needing to keep that lively left hand going for that much longer. Once I've identified my sections, I'll then divide these sections into segments. So I think in the first section we've got a couple of segments, and then in the second section we have a couple more. And then finally, I'll divide each of these segments into what I call snippets. So these are my smallest building blocks, and this is what I'll use to start my practice with initially. So now we've worked out our structure, it's time to think about how we might conquer this piece. So then, to start conquering this, let's have a look at that first segment. Now you might wonder why I've bothered splitting the first 4 measures into 2 segments, because effectively they're pretty much the same notes. However, what I've discovered is that if I'm likely to find something a little tricky, which in this case will be the left hand, then the smaller the snippets I start with, the better. This is basically because the more notes we put together at any one time, the more mistakes we're likely to keep making, and therefore the more daunted we're likely to become with it. So we keep it nice and short, and that way it very soon comes right. So when I start to practice something new, I always like to think about how many different ways I can go about practicing it, as opposed to just repeating the notes. Also, the more difficult I think something's likely to be, then the more ways I'm going to try to find to be able to practice it. Now, for me, there are two principal things with this piece that are a little tricky. The first is the rhythm, which is sort of very cleverly syncopated, and it's marked by the right-hand octaves. And if you look very carefully, you'll see that sometimes these octaves fall at the same time as the left hand, and sometimes they don't. So trying to get this rhythm nice and settled in our minds is really important. And then the second thing that's tricky with it is the fact that we've got the left hand jumping around, and it's going from an octave to a chord and then of course back again. Now, whilst it's probably possible to start practicing this as written, especially if we slow it down enough, the good thing that I found was to actually simplify it so that we can focus more on just the rhythm and the left hand to start with. And a handy way to do this is if we take all of the single notes that are in the right hand and we simply omit them and only play the octaves, then of course, first we just have a set of E-flat octaves in the right hand, so we're not jumping about anywhere, and of course then we've got a lot less notes to think about. And then when we put just these octaves with the left hand, the rhythm is reinforced in our minds for us. However, we can even take this a step further by simplifying the left hand. And a useful way that I found to practice jumps, in fact it came from Graham Fitch, is to actually, if you're jumping to a chord, rather than try to land on all the notes, only land on some of them. So in this case, it's always a triad that we've got in the left hand, so we can practice just landing on 2 of the 3 notes. This means that first we can omit the top note, then we can omit the bottom note, and then finally we can omit the middle note. And then finally, if we still think this is likely to be a challenge, we can use what I call the add-on technique, which is where we start with a small number of notes and we progressively add notes to that. So here, we could start up with just the pickup and the first beat of the first measure. Then we can add another one. Then we can add another one. And we keep on doing this, basically, until we've got the entire snippet done. This, of course, then means that we're able to start off practicing hands together without needing to worry about being daunted by what we need to do. And the reason I do this, and I've talked about it before, was that I read in Neuhaus's book, The Art of Piano Playing, that in actual fact we should really think of hand-separate practice as an emergency exit, so not our first starting point, but only something we use in an emergency situation where we can't do anything else. So then finally, before we put our hands to the keyboard, let's just think about the tempo approach. Now, we've all seen it multiple times that the best thing to do is start off as slowly as possible so that we just can't make any mistakes. Now, I used to do this myself all the time, I admit, until recently, and I read a book by William Westney called The Perfect Wrong Note. And he says that in actual fact, we should do the reverse. We should start full speed, we should relinquish control, as he puts it, and just go for it. And this makes, to me, a lot of logical sense, because of course the reflexes we need to jump quickly are not the same as moving slowly and then making micro adjustments when we arrive there. Because basically, he likens this kind of thing to target practice, and again, those are the words they used, and I think this makes sense. And of course, given that we've simplified the left hand and the right hand, and we're going to start with add-on, then this should be perfectly manageable, I think, shouldn't it? So let's give the first few notes a go and see how we get on. And of course, we can practice this using add-on with all of the 3 different variants in the left hand that we've looked at. Well, the 4th as well, of course, if you include playing the entire chord. That said though, I'd avoid adding notes on until you feel that you can reliably make that jump and hit the target each time. Now, if you're very subconscious about people hearing all of these wrong notes, another way that you could perhaps do this would be to make the jump quickly, but not to actually press the keys, and just to look to see if your fingers are in the right place first. And in fact, William Westley says in his book that it's a shame more of us aren't in a position where we are in, complete privacy when we practice piano, because it's very off-putting to worry about people hearing this train wreck, as it were, as we start to get something under control. Then, once we are in a position that we can get the entire snippet right using the chord in the left hand, so the fourth variant, we can then start to add the second snippet. And the reason I say it makes sense to add the second snippet at this point is simply because it's a repeat note for note, apart from the very last 16th note in the right hand. And again, we can do this using the add-on technique. Now, another thing I got from William Westley's book, and it's something that he's very keen on, is that we constantly think about how something feels. Now, what I've noticed in the past is if I'm playing something where I need to concentrate intently on it, I can quite often start to tense up. And it's not only on piano. I don't know if you've noticed this, but sometimes if we're intently concentrating on something, trying to work something out, then we might clench our teeth or clench our fists or whatever without really realizing it. And of course, neither of these things actually helps our brain do what it needs to do. So then as we start adding notes on, let's constantly ask ourselves, how did that feel? Did we manage to get all of those notes and still feel relaxed? Is our left hand feeling nice and supple as it jumps from octave to chord? And of course, don't forget to ask yourself the same question about the right hand, because you're playing a stream of octaves, which also can lead to tension, especially if you've got smaller hands. Then as a final stage with this simplified right hand, what we can actually do is start to loop those first four measures. So in fact, the first two snippets. First, just loop them twice. Then try looping 3 times. Then try looping 4 times. And don't try and do this all in one day. Take your time, do it over a number of days, and eventually you should start to feel that, in fact, you could probably loop it indefinitely without getting tense or tired. And remember, don't loop until the point that you do start to feel tired, because your brain will start to recognize this tense feeling with playing this piece, which we don't want. Now, at the same time as we start to practice looping these first 4 measures, we can also start to think about adding in the remaining notes of the right hand. And the way I do this to start with would be basically to use a dotted rhythm. Because what this has the effect of doing is it effectively slows the left hand down, because we don't want the shortest note to become a 32nd note, if you like. We want it to remain a 16th note, so the other notes will slow down that little bit. Again, start this off with a single snippet to start with, and only once you feel confident and comfortable with one snippet, start to add the second one. And of course, you can then start looping using your dotted rhythms as well. Then once you're happy with your dotted rhythms and the looping, start to practice it as written. Then to add a bit of variety, what you can also do is loop it, but alternate between the simplified right hand and the as written right hand without stopping. Now let's look at how we could practice the third snippet. And as you can see here, it doesn't really lend itself to a simplified right hand. So perhaps we just start this off using dotted rhythms. And again, going back to what I said earlier, it's only when something's likely to be tricky that we need lots of different ways to practice. And I think this, given that the left and the right hands barely need to move around, then we could probably just do dotted rhythms and as written. Then, when we move to the fourth snippet, this again gives us even a different way of practicing it. And I think a useful way of doing this as we're trying to get ourselves used to moving the right hand an octave at a time upwards is to basically play the right hand simply as a block chord. And of course, as well as block chords, we can also use dotted rhythms here too. And then another thing I noticed that sort of helps with this is that the left hand repeats the bottom note of what the right hand had just played. Now let's look at our second segment. Again, I'd break this down into 2-measure snippets, but if we look carefully, most of the time it makes more practical sense to actually start our snippet with the tied 16th notes rather than the start of the measure. And this helps us to reinforce the rhythm better. Now the first and the third snippets are very similar, and these I would basically practice with dotted rhythms. The second and the fourth are also very similar. However, my approach here will be a bit different. And again, I'd use my idea of the simplified right hand by removing all of these individual 16th notes, and then also perhaps using add-on so that I start to progressively add a left hand chord plus the corresponding notes in the right hand. Now you might prefer to add on 2 chords at a time in your left hand here, and if you do, by all means go ahead and do that. You know, there's no hard and fast rule here about what we need to do. The last thing I'd say that is, whilst basically the notes in the 2 pairs of snippets are pretty much the same, they are an octave apart. So I think it was worth practicing them individually, because of course our hands are in a different position, so we'll be at a slightly different angle, and we want to get comfortable with the feeling of where we are and make sure we're using the right kind of movement and position when we play. Now let's look at the second section. Here, each of the segments is pretty much identical, so when practicing single snippets, we can limit ourselves to just working on the first segment at first. Again, we can use 2 measures as a snippet here, as the chord changes every 2 measures. We can use the simplified right hand and left hands again. Again, as we did for the first snippet of segment 1, we remove the individual 16th notes from the right hand, so we're only playing the octaves, and in the left hand we practice only 2 of the 3 notes of the chord. We can also use add-on and looping here. As we work on each individual snippet, let's add a left hand note as we did earlier when working on the first segment. We can then loop snippets 1 and 2, and we can also loop snippets 3 and 4. Now, one thing that I did find handy with the right hand was when playing the octaves on black notes, use a relatively high wrist, and on the octaves on white notes with a relatively lower wrist. I think this is simply because it encourages a greater degree of mobility in the hand and helps us to stop locking it into a single position, which I think would become much more tiring. A final thing you might prefer to do is to extend each individual snippet to include the first beat or so of the following one, which I'll be honest is what I tended to do. So then, once we've got all of this groundwork done, we're ready to start our integration step. And the first idea is to be able to get each segment that we can play end to end. Now, whilst we've done looping and other things, I'd be inclined to avoid trying to go from one snippet to all of the snippets together. And I'd add them progressively, because I've basically found that the more I need to do, the more likely I am to get tense. So this in fact means that we can do 2 snippets at a time, and then we can do 3 snippets at a time. I also found that it's really helpful to keep removing our hands from the keyboard. So let's say we practice in snippets 2 and 3, and we're going to do 3 iterations of them. So what I would do is I'd do the first iteration, remove my hands from the keyboard, then do the second, remove my hands again, and then do the third. Of course, given we've practiced all of these different snippets in dotted rhythms, we can also practice our integration step in dotted rhythms too. Then once we're happy that we can get both of the segments, independently okay, it's time to start adding them together. And again, don't just jump from going to 2 segments straight away. Use the add-on method. And the way I'd add on is not a note at a time this time, rather I'd add on an entire snippet at a time. So we start with the first segment plus the first snippet of segment 2, then 2 snippets of segment 2, then 3 snippets of segment 2, then 4 snippets of segment 2. And again, do this over a number of days if you like. You don't need to achieve this in one go. We need to make sure we keep remaining nice and relaxed whilst we're doing this. Now, when we're integrating the second section, my recommendation is to first integrate this using the simplified right hand. The reason I say this is that the first segment, the different snippets had a sort of a different musical design. So you can't use a simplified right hand all the way through. But here, it's pretty much the same. It's octaves and single notes in the right hand, octaves and chords in the left. And that pattern's maintained from the beginning to the end of the entire section. And again, I do this integrating 2 snippets at a time first, then 3 snippets at a time, before doing all 4 snippets at a time. Now, when we come to add the 2 segments together here, a different way that we can approach this is to actually start, say, from the second snippet of the first segment to the end of the first snippet of the second segment. And then we move across to the third. And then after that, we start doing 5 snippets together, then 6 snippets together, then 7, before finally all 8 of them. Once we're getting comfortable with the simplified right hand, another option then is to start integrating in exactly the same way. So starting with 2 snippets, then 3, then 4, using the dotted rhythm variant. It's only when all of this starts to feel easy would I go to try and integrate the as written version. And again, do it 2 snippets at a time. If you find this very easy to do, which you might by now, then do it 3 snippets at a time. Now, perhaps the last thing to think about in our integrate phase is, of course, the joins. We've got a join between sections 1 and 2. We've got a join at the repeat of section 2. And then, of course, we've got the join between sections 2 and 3. Therefore, I basically use my as written variant to practice these joins, and I do it by the last snippet and the first snippet. Then, of course, our final step is to try and add all of our sections together. And keeping the theme going, I'd again do this using the add-on method. However, this time, let's add on by segment at a time. So we start off with the first section plus the first segment of the second section. And we can also use the second segment of the first section to the end of the second section. Then, of course, we do the second section and the first segment of the third section. I'm sure you get the idea by now. The idea is simply to make sure that we don't add too many notes at a time, that we start to get that tired or that daunted feeling by doing it. Now, you might think all of this sounds a bit like overkill, but what I've noticed is that if I try to move forward too quickly or in too big a jump, it just doesn't work and things start to fall apart and I start to get tired again. I mean, I'm sure you're like me, you've recognized this feeling that you get to the end of something you find difficult and you want to do an air punch because you're so relieved that you got there with no wrong notes. And whilst this is a great feeling to have, it shouldn't be the feeling we're really aiming for, should it? Before we even put our hands across the keyboard, we should just expect everything to work, shouldn't we? And that's what we need to be aiming for. And basically, I think that if we build a piece up progressively like this, it helps us to feel confident and comfortable from beginning to end. Now, the only other thing you might want to do is think about a little flourish to go at the end of this. And basically all I did was add an octave in the left hand and the right hand at the end of the piece. Don't forget you can download the detailed practice notes from the link in the description. And if you want to learn the trio, then you can use these exact same techniques to do that. Have lots of fun and don't forget to subscribe to Tommy's Piano Corner. Don't forget, of course, the little bell icon so that you're notified of new videos as and when they're released. I do thank you very much for watching today, and I look forward to seeing you very soon.